All right, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully I am now live. I am just going to watch the comments here for a few moments to make sure that all of this is working as it should. For whatever reason, whenever I decide to stream, I end up with my computer going apeshit and the fan fires up. I don't know if it's just a heavy hit on the processor or what's going on with it, but yeah. We are probably going to have the sound of a fan in the background. Now I have moved a microphone as close to me as I can get it in the hopes that it will minimize that background sound. Can you guys let me know whether or not everything is good with audio and video? Please let me know in the comments if this is working as it should. There is a delay here, so between when I speak and you see it, there's probably a good 15 seconds. So bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for this opening nonsense we continuously have to go through due to my sterling boomer tech credentials. Welcome, one and all. Okay, somebody just indicated some background white noise. Yes, that is the damned fan. All right, so the video looks good. I realized I had to put some sort of weird sun visor on my camera in order to keep it from, going white. All right, so there is the fan. In future, what I may do is just click a little mic on my neck here, but I'm going to have to sort out how to do that. At this point, if I tried to do it, I would very likely create a situation that was far worse than what we started with. So, yeah. Okay, welcome everyone. This is an Ask Me Anything stream. And what I'm going to do is ask you guys to vote on which one you would like me to start with. I mean, we're going to have general Ask Me Anything type stuff. But before we get to that question and answer phase, we have a few things that I want to tap. One of them is, several of them actually, a couple of them at least, are from Twitter. When I mentioned this the other day, I asked people for their input, and I got one request from one Streeb, regarding aesthetics and its relation to ethics. So if you want that one, you can type aesthetics. Another question was from Book of Coppola, and for whatever reason I have that associated with Coppola. I have that associated with Darkest Sky. This was for my quick thoughts on a Imperium art discussion that some of the White Art Collective guys just did, one of whom I've spoken with in the past, Nullis, a very nice guy, very, very interested in poetry, and down with his Hungarian roots, or should I say Magyar. And I also had a question from Anteos on the origins of Western esoteric traditions. So, vote. We'll see which one you guys want me to start with, and I'll go through some of those. I've also got a number of notes that I made for possible things to talk about with Unwashed in a recent stream that I did with him, and I'd like to tap a number of those. That's the whole business of culture. Culture. Yes, indeed, culture. So I'll be waiting to see if you guys type in which one you want me to start with. Otherwise, I should just say welcome, one and all. Somebody told me here in the comments that that I look a little bit purple. That's another issue. I set the contrast and the rest for this before I figured out my little light visor thing that brought the contrast back, but perhaps a bit too much. Anyway, enough of my mumbling. I am merely waiting for anyone to vote. If nobody votes, I am just going to start, because ultimately we'll get to each one of these things eventually. What else do I have to cover while you guys are thinking about it? This is a book. This is a test copy or whatever from Amazon of a cyberpunky science fiction book that I wrote once upon a time back in the day. So it's got the not for resale crap across the front. But it is close to being ready. It is set in Istanbul in the not so distant future. I wrote it when I was but a lad, and I have now reread it for the second goddamn time, going through it to proof it, and soon this book will be available for sale. It is something I produced because of my old days reading, Weird Tales type pulp, Robert E. Howard type stuff. I miss the days when you could pick up a proper sized science fiction or fantasy book that you could sit down with. Now they want to sell it by weight, and I like the idea of stories that you can read, without having to spend quite as much time with it. All right, it looks like we're getting Western esoteric traditions first. This is another one. This is a collection of my poetry. I hate this fucking glossy cover. You can see that it has the not for resale on it as well. I'm going to be going with a matte cover eventually. And this is a collection of my poems, which will eventually be for sale as well. I'm going to be selling me some books, peoples. Okay. Now, what do we have here? It looks like Western esoteric traditions is where we should start. Before I do that, let me say, please do go check out my discussion with Unwashed. If you haven't seen it, I think it's on something called Unwashed New or Unwashed Alternate or Unwashed Second. Damn it. I'll try to remember to put the link to it in the comments. If you guys know what the new channel name he has is, plug it in down in the comments below. There's also a discussion I recently did with Guide to Culture. It's a while back now, but I still think it's an interesting discussion, though. When I went back and watched it again, half the time I was like, what the hell am I talking about? So, yeah, thanks. Thanks to my wonderful viewers who stick with me, even though half the time even I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, Unwashed Season 2, it looks like. All right, we got Fiend J in the house. I am very happy to see a mod. Thank you, sir, for checking it out. All right. Enough of all this background noise with me mumbling. Let's start with Teos's question on the origins of Western esoteric traditions. Now, depending on who you ask, there's every chance you're going to hear all kinds of different ideas about where all of this comes from. There are different ways of looking at it. There are different facets of all of this. So this is just one. It happens to be mine. And it basically comes down to a number of different things. There are a few different elements. The first and most important is a focus on space, on understanding space, on organizing space, on measuring space. So you can go all the way back to these Vedic fire priests who have a cingulum around their waist, a knotted cord, and it has knots at intervals on it that amount to a system of measuring, and they used it to measure their fire altars. And then you have the whole idea of measurement in general, whether it's talents as a unit of measure, whether it's feet, whether it's spans, from the width of the palm or from the finger to the end of the thumb to the end of the pinky, whether it's a cubit measured. So you have the idea of measurement, and you have the idea of space. But then there is the idea of how to organize and understand things in space. And that has to do with two fundamental things. And they are category and instance. So a category mark is, something that tells you what category of thing you are dealing with. An instance can be anything from seeing the aforementioned category mark repeated, or it can be something like a tally mark, where you've got a category mark up above, and underneath it you put what are called hash marks. Like in the United States, I think in many other countries, we do a thing where we make 4 of them vertically, and then we do a slash across for 5. That's a tally mark. So tally marks lead to counting. Category marks lead to the idea of a class of things. The category mark that relates to a class of things is that thing from which we derive our understanding of an archetype. That is an idea of a first stamping, the archetypos, the governing imprint. So you create a mold, and then anything stamped with that mold is an instance of a thing that falls under that category. And I hope it becomes apparent how category and instance underpin not just the measurement of space, eventually things like mathematics, grouping, military arrangements, things like the biblical book of Numbers. The business of category and instance also have to do with bloodlines, with breeding, And ultimately it all comes around when as soon as you introduce the idea of an archetype, you have the idea of forms. And of course, idea is sort of a Greek word for form, and it's no accident that it's related to ideal. And for me, based on my own studies, this all goes back to tracks, animal marks on the ground. My position, as you can see if you look at any of my videos in the marks playlist, my position is that writing came before speech. And this is a great heresy, an absolutely unutterable, vile heresy for academia today, because they've all been trained in textual traditions, and they are in large part unconscious of the net of words that they are bound in. From my position, before speech ever existed, we had the idea of category and instance coming from tracks, environmental and territorial marks. So if you see, as I often say, a wolf print, a wolf's track on the ground, you have the category of wolf. But you also have a specific wolf, so you have the idea of an instance of wolf. And from category and instance, all of these things emerge. Now, there's a close association with different types of writing systems, whether they be phonetic, whether they be what's called, ideographic. There's this idea of being able to store knowledge and share it. And in this respect, it becomes possible for human beings to share their insights, whether esoteric or not, for those who are able to read. Now, read is an interesting word that everybody should look into, because it has more to do with to heed and to judge, to render a judgment. We only later came up with the idea of this business of read in terms of your eyes scanning text much later. Likewise, like ritan, written, write, in the Germanic languages, that actually comes from an old word for scratch or claw, which goes back to environmental marks made by animals, like on the trunk of a tree. Now, all of this has to do with space, in the sense that you look at something on the ground and you see a track. You begin to follow the tracks on the ground, and you become able to read those tracks on the ground, and they have an order, which is indicated by which way the animal's toes or claws are facing. The heel points to backwards, the toes or claws point to forwards. So we have the idea of reading a sequence of text on the ground, being able to understand the story, but that secret knowledge is only available to those who are able to read the signs. And a great deal of, how shall I say this, initiation is necessary in order to eventually learn how to read these signs. So you have the idea of secret orders, which go back to hunting parties, where the young man would be brought out by the older hunters, who would explain to them that this piece of scat versus that piece of scat is left by this animal or the other. This idea of ripping the barks off of trees, or deer that rub the velvet off their antlers seasonally against trees, marks left by cats clawing surfaces. This is all initiatory, and once you learn to read those secret symbols, you gain survival advantage, because you're now more likely to kill an animal and eat it for dinner, and less likely to be killed by an animal and to be eaten for dinner. So it's very old, it's very straightforward, but here I am wandering all over the place. This goes back to the idea of space. When you're reading those marks on the ground, they have an order, and you have sequence, and you have category and instance. You can count the number of times an animal has left a little pile of scat near some environmental feature that it wants to claim as its own as it patrols its territory. Category and instance. But you see how the paths and the territorial marks all relate to space, and not just conceived as a plane with certain features on it, which gives you the idea of territory that you own or defend, and routes for defending it, and strong points like the nest or mating areas, and all the rest that is central to human culture. There's also a vertical dimension, the y-axis, and that relates to hierarchy and rank. Whether you look at a totem pole, And I was recently told, apparently, that the people at the bottom of the totem pole were more important than those at the top. But in nature, what we see is that the larger animals can scratch higher or deposit scent marks higher. And so you get rank and order. And it's almost as though you have the idea of king of the hill and strong ground, he who holds the strongest ground. So I'm just tapping a number of things, but ultimately, category, instance, and concern with space, these lead you to somebody like Pythagoras, sitting on the ground with groups of pebbles and meditating upon the qualitative aspects of, for example, even versus odd. And you also have the idea of applying space to things that are perhaps not spatial at the outset, and thereby extracting more knowledge from it. So take Pythagoras' experiment with a monochord. Well, you have the idea of pitch, and you start thinking about it. Well, some is higher and some is lower, right? But there's also measuring the chord. So you get, let's say a C note. If the string of your monochord is tuned to C, if you split it perfectly in half, then you have the C note one octave up if you pluck on either side. And of course, that's a basis of, producing sounds from strings. Now, that's just one attempt to show the way in which all of this sort of knits together. I could noodle my way into all sorts of backwaters with this. That is not my intention at this point, but I want to show that there are fundamental understandings with marks and signs in our environment, concern with space, navigation and orientation within it, that lead us to category and instance, which then lead us to number and all sorts of other things having to do with the emergence of esoteric thought in the West. Now, I know it sounds strange. You're like, well, math, that's not always esoteric. Well, when it started, it was. And we can see echoes of this with, for example, everybody talks about alchemy as though it's interesting only insofar as it forms some early phase of our understanding of chemistry. And as soon as we got through the benighted nonsense of it and moved on to focusing on moles and molecules and all the rest, it carried us forward. Likewise, when we had more concern with the qualitative dimensions of number, that was much more mystical, as we distinctly see with the traditions, surrounding Pythagoras. And I'm not supposed to be looking at the chat here, but I did notice somebody just mentioned masonry. Yes, that gives us space and the organization of space and constraints that shape how human beings can interact and regulate human behavior in ways that affect how society manifests. I see people mentioning the quadrivium. Well, you've got the quadrivium and the trivium, and those have to do with marks across the ground because they're where either where you have an intersection of 3 or 4 roads. And these are, I could go on forever, and there are a number of other points that I wanted to tap here, but for those who are interested, there is a book that I helped to edit and that I contributed to called Traditional Marking Systems. You can find it on Amazon. And there is another one, an article that some of it's redundant because I took elements of that book that I mentioned and applied it in this article that I'm mentioning here. It was published by Elsevier in Language Sciences. And you can find that online. Now, I don't make any money from any of it because I did not get paid for that work, and I don't get paid from any of it being sold. For example, Elsevier does. So if people are really interested in that sort of thing, you can get in touch, and some of it I can send you in digital form if it's up your alley. Okay, so there's a basic discussion of what I think is an important set of elements that all sort of underpin the Western esoteric traditions. So what's next? Well, before we get to aesthetics, let me maybe tap this Imperium art discussion thing. Now, I watched this and enjoyed it. I only have a couple of quick things to say about it. And I have to say at the outset that I can only address personal aesthetics, because I think the question that was originally thrown out there was about collectively and individually, the role of aesthetics and ethics. I can only come at it from the perspective of individual aesthetics, because for me they're the basics of my ethics. And I know it sounds like I'm setting this up to be some big deal. It really isn't. Basically, right and wrong for me is based on memory and imagination. That's how I navigate. For things that have occurred in the past, I apply my I contemplate my memories, and I also imagine alternate, routes I could have taken in the future. I throw a loop with those memories forward into the future, and I imagine possible eventualities. But the aesthetics, the dimension of aesthetics personally that helps me to navigate, and the reason that I say aesthetics are central to my ethics, is that I simply look at myself on the stage of my memory or imagination, and I attempt to feel honestly whether seeing myself in that circumstance, whether or not I like myself. And so I say, oh, if it were like that, I can see myself there, I would be a repulsive imbecile. I would be foolish. I would be repugnant. Or, that looks good. I like that. That, I think, is suitable for me. And I would own it, if confronted about it in the future. And I look back upon my memories in the same way. So that, as I said, it's not a big deal, but for me it's very central, because people will tell me, X, Y, or Z is right and proper, and E, F, and G are wrong and to be avoided. And I think that any kind of universal rule that can be applied in all times and places is a will-o'-the-wisp. It's nonsense. You have to measure the ethical rightness or wrongness of a course of action based upon a very specific set of contexts and circumstances. And so universal rules tend to break down, and they tend to lead to normative posturing that I think is of very limited value in many respects. And so for me, aesthetics are what determine whether or not I think something is right and wrong, and it comes from just sort of a native sense of whether a thing looks good or bad on me, around me, if I look good or bad in or of that scene. So, yeah, it's basically a sense of, I'm not trying to say I look beautiful, but in the sense of like an appreciation of beauty, I can say, yeah, that's an ugly situation, and I would not want to be the centerpiece of it. Whereas that's a beautiful situation, and I think, the gemstone that is me looks very proper in that setting. So, yeah. Now, in terms of specifics, I only have a couple of points. Kent, I believe, was one of his names, was brought up the idea of whether or not we need our own symbolic language in the West. And the first thing that came to mind is that we have one. It's long-standing. It's been around for, at least 3,000 years, and it's called sort of the Western cultural canon. And so I don't see any need to recreate one. I would say that we could discover one in the sense of, sweeping the dirt off of it and removing all the garbage that's, been deposited on top of it, or to burnish away the verdigris, in order to see what is there that is our heritage. So taking a look, for example, at mythology. How many different ways do we have established for us with symbol sets that serve beautifully to encapsulate all sorts of ideas, and they're not just there in their earliest primitive form, they're also there in layers upon layers of reinterpretation. I'm just trying to think of some of them that come to mind, like from mythology. Look at it like this whole story that I just was trying to tell about marks and tracks and information and orientation in space. Well, you find out that Apollo, who's associated with a glorious shining reason and the intellect, and this word that's so fashionable currently, logos, this Apollonian figure, Apollo himself, associating with writing and the arts, with the muses organized under his suzerainty. Well, Hermes strolls in and rips him off. Steals all his cattle. Steals all of Apollo's cattle. And how does he do it without being caught? Because he fakes the tracks. He goes in faking a set of tracks. I believe, at least in some of the stories, he reversed them. So as he went forward, it looked like he was walking away. And you see how this interesting idea of the marks and signs, just to do a little bit of ta'wil or exegesis or bringing down, you see in this story how the god of logos and reason is tricked because the marks have been monkeyed with. And that, I think, has a lot to do with how academics have been so tricked and rolled up and so neatly done a number with, because they believe it's all text and word-based reasoning. And that the idea is that you know, you lay it out. Like Greek logic is really just a way to almost make mathematical statements using words. And of course it breaks down, but that's what they're trying to do. You know, a syllogism, you know, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. But it doesn't work out as neatly. It's susceptible to manipulation. And so what's happening here with the use of these marks? Well, I think it points to the fact that you can have order without spoken language, as we see with the animals using their marks in space, but there are all kinds of ways to manipulate using marks and signs, like misleading tracks, that even the god of reason, logos, light, and the arts themselves would not notice, because it all operates beneath the level of word-based reasoning. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which that marks and signs, particularly commercial marks and signs, are used to manipulate us. Anyway, to come back around to this basic idea, you have this question about our own symbolic language, and we have one that's extensive. I mean, I just went digging around into symbolism related to Hecate and her association with walls and thorny hedges that separate the living from the dead and the wild from the domesticated. You can go and dig, as I have done, into the symbol of the caduceus itself, and find out, you know, as I'm looking now, I have this hypothesis that it was very early on a distaff, because Iris carried it as well as Mercury, and early remarks about it indicated that it had 2 fillets of wool wrapped around it. And I found plenty of examples of Balkan distaffs that look much like a caduceus. Anyway, there are all kinds of ways that you can dig into our existing cultural tradition, and a kind of truth comes out of it. Or take a look, for example, and it's long-standing. Like, look at Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare talks about Queen Mab. You know, she is the fairies' midwife, and comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone. You know, so Queen Mab goes back to these old folk traditions. In many cases, Shakespeare is rolling back further into classical traditions. You know, so if he says, how many cowards whose hearts are all as false as stairs of sand, wear yet upon their chins the beards of Hercules or frowning Mars, who, inward searched, have livers white as milk. These but assume valor's excrement to render them redoubted. Hearts as false as stairs of sand. But he talks about beards of Hercules or frowning Mars. And then you can follow Mars back, and you can take a look at Botticelli's Mars and Venus, where Mars has been put to sleep, totally emptied, satiated by Venus herself, and therefore lies in his power and can't be woken, you know. And you can roll back even further to, you know, Mars and iron, and there are all sorts of traditions of this. You get it with like, in a very late, superficial, brought down to date version, like in Crowley's book 777, where he tries to set up clusterings of correspondences. So yeah, I believe we have our own symbolic language, and it just takes digging into that history and that background and understanding the continuity of it across time. I mean, there's, and much of it you have to really look at closely in order to discover. So I went looking into sew and suture, sewing, sutures, sewing a suture, suture, sutra, and the idea of sacred text. And you'll see that a Buddhist teaching sign is when you hold up your fingers like this. Someone can freeze a little screenshot of this and, show me to be the evil white supremacist I am. But this is a teaching gesture. It's the idea of placing your fingers on the thread and following it, much as one would pick up the line of text, coming back to paths and marks on the ground and following it in linear sequence where it has order to it. You'd follow the string. And yet we find that when women are spinning with a distaff and drop spindle, they're doing it with their finger as it comes off of the flax or whatever is taken from the top of the distaff and wound around the spindle and turned as it spins on the ground. So you're creating the thread. And so teaching gesture is about seizing the thread and following it, but it's also forming that strand. So, I mean, there's so many ways that this whole thing can unfold, but that takes digging into our own existing culture, and that in turn gives you the ability to layer new levels upon that should you wish to. But only knowledge of our traditions is sufficient to provide a nice level basis for continuing those traditions, right? If you half understand them, then you're very likely to end up with something like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So that's a quick response on the business of our symbolic languages. The short answer is we have one. And we have many of them, interrelated, intertwined, if you will, almost as though in a skein. And it's necessary to dig them out and make the most of them and continue to develop them, to see them complexify or to distill them in certain ways to bring them back around, for the current year. And there was another one where Nullis was mentioning catharsis. And I just wanted to address that one. After I talk about this, we'll jump on to what else do we have here? We got aesthetics in relation to ethics. We have Imperium art discussion. We have Anteos on Western esoteric tradition. So yeah, I'll jump over to some of the cultural stuff in just a moment. But yes, what do we have here? Nullis on catharsis. I talked a bit in the past with my friend Tim about catharsis, and he had a very interesting way of putting it. Again, we're returning to a thread, a winding thread that serves to bind everything together. Bind, band, bond. Yes. League, ligature. They all come from the same root. I cannot go down etymological roads, or I'm going to make all of you crazy and I'll get lost in my own underwear. Catharsis. The way it was described to me once long ago by Mr. Tim was, you can think of an experience. Let's take a page from The Art of Memory and think of a statue there. Your experience, your memory that you look back on is a kind of statue there standing in the atrium of the memory. And so you want to look back on it. That statue is your experience. Well, there's an interesting thing going on there with, how do I say this? In the, if you will, psychological theory of philosophers long ago, every memory image that gets formed, and one of the big ways that they explained it was the idea of an archetype, a first stamping. I believe it was Plato who discussed the memory being like wax, and if it's soft, you have a bad memory, it doesn't hold an image. If you have too hard a wax, you try to make an impression with a seal ring or seal stone or whatever, and it's too hard, it resists taking the impression. Well, the idea is that your experiences coming in from the senses are gathered together in the Aristotelian idea, the common sense, which is understood by later practitioners of the art of memory as an atrium of sorts, where the various elements of a sense impression form an image. And it's a synesthetic impression in many respects. God, I got to figure out how to just talk about what I need to, or I'll be here all night. Catharsis. You have an image that's been formed by your experience. Every image that is formed has a charge, which was called in Latin, it's intentio, which isn't quite like intention. Intentio was the emotional charge associated with the forming of an image in the atrium of the common sense, which then becomes a part of memory. So So an image has an emotional association. So say that I remember being in Barcelona with a woman I was very in love with, and the relationship was going in all kinds of fucked up directions, and it seemed like it was going to fall apart. But it's that moment. It's an image Tim pointed out to me long ago in Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, where there's a little glass sphere and this little white and black figure are sitting next to each other. It's more alchemical than racial, I would expect. And they seem to be in perfect love with the flowers blooming around them, but the crystal sphere around them is about to crack. And I had that feeling, like, this is shit, it's all about to fall apart. Oh my God, there's so much intense emotion with it. So now whenever I see a proper hedge maze, particularly when it has a classical statue in the center of it, it triggers that memory, and the emotions come with it because it's so perfect. Is the relationship going to continue? Am I lost in a labyrinth? What is the way out? And yet the air around was all damp with mist that was falling. The sky looked almost purple. The trees were very, very green with the moisture resting on them. So it was this labyrinth of desire. And the expiration date stamped on our hopes and fears. So when the image comes up, the feeling comes up with it. Or, for example, the business being hit from behind by cars and wrecks. I've had it happen a couple of times, and now whenever I hear someone slamming on the brakes behind me, if I hear a skidding behind me or whatever, I'm immediately like, I want to brace my neck. I'm like, here it comes again, right? It's like what they like to call being triggered. The intentio is the emotional charge associated with an image, and it's strong. And so what very often happens when you have catharsis, I'm still missing a part of Tim's story. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place here, people. You have the image that's formed in the memory. It has an emotional charge. Let's think about it like a statue. And as you experience and re-experience that image, let's take the golden thread of your conscious awareness and sort of wind it around the image. As you understand different parts of the image, as you come back to the memory and view it again, maybe I should have said this, maybe I should have done that, if I'd hit the brake sooner, if I'd pulled to the right, if I had been more demanding of my partner in certain ways, perhaps it wouldn't have fallen off the cliff in this direction or that direction. And the consciousness goes around it as you revisit memory, applying the tools of the imagination. It's as though you wound a golden thread around and around and around this awareness. Well, catharsis is like knocking over the tower. It's much like catharsis is essentially the tower in the 22 major arcana of the tarot cards. The whole thing gets knocked over. To take a line from the Ballad of the White Horse, archers and engineers, the whole damn tower falls down. Catharsis is where it's all just shattered and it falls to pieces. But when that happens, the golden thread that was wrapped around the object falls into a knotted mess. And if you try to pick it up at any point, it just becomes a tangled mess. Nothing is resolved because the structure was knocked down in an emotional moment of extremis. But there was no understanding. Tim used to say you must understand the structure because then you know where to place the charges. Catharsis is a way of buying yourself a certain amount of time. It's like lancing a boil without dealing with the infection. It's gonna come back. The structure will be recreated in some variation because it was never understood. It's there in the first place in your memory and imagination because it requires your attention. You must understand it. And so this whole business of, suddenly there was a catharsis and, all of this emotional tension was released and I felt this great sense of exhaustion and relief and I fell down and I slept for 10 days and then it was like there was a new world. Well, over a certain amount of time, you're going to recreate some variation of the circumstances that caused it to be there in the first place because the lesson still has not been learned. And the best way to deal with it is to go back to that image, and rather than relying upon catharsis, take the golden thread and say, this is where I wrapped it this way, this is where I wrapped it this way, and unwind it from that set of experiences in such a fashion that you know why the thing developed in the first place, how your understandings and misunderstandings developed, and then what need is there to bulldoze the thing when you can simply become larger than it is. If you're standing right up next to a doorway and you're this far away from it, you'll be like, all of existence is blocked and my way forward is impossible. There is nothing I can do. Every time I turn one way or the other, I am blocked. I tell you, I am blocked. But if you just step back 2 paces from the door and look at it, you realize, oh, that's a door, not a wall. So that's why I have a certain amount of suspicion related to the idea of catharsis. Now, this isn't to come down on Nullis. He's a nice guy. I enjoyed speaking with him on his channel. In no way is this an attack on him, but I think that there is value in being very, very suspicious of catharsis because it's fundamentally unconscious. And if you have an unconscious reprieve from a lesson, well, the nature of this place is that we are here to learn one way or another, kicking and screaming or with style and panache. And so whether the thing seems to fall down or not, whether you have a momentary reprieve or not, the real question is, did you learn the lesson? So, now we have some stuff here on this business of culture. Culture is very, very interesting. I'm not even sure how I want to break into this subject here. I guess I should start. I have do work still on occasion, not now with Corona-chan destroying everything. I work often with organizations, big commercial organizations, companies, in terms of their branding and also their, how shall I say it, their institutional identity. And it's very, very interesting to deal with these companies because the leadership of these companies they come and they go. They're there, with chief marketing officers, for crying out loud, they're seldom there more than like 6 months. Like every 6 months to a year, you'd see that the CMO is getting booted. COOs, people like that, more having to do with operations and concrete prices and the rest, you'll see that they often last longer because they're less about fashion. The CEO, the C-suite top dog, those guys will be cycled in and out. And you know what's odd is that they're generally cycled out pretty much in keeping with the sort of time periods that are associated with exit strategies. You make an investment, how long do you want to be in there? 3 to 5 years, right? And then you're supposed to be gone. And what that does, that focus on that 3 to 5 year time frame, what it does is it makes for a kind of institutional schizophrenia. You have people who cannot remember what came before. They don't know. I mean, the number of times that I've been brought in by a client and they're like, well, we want to solve problem X or problem Y, and we want you to dig into this. And we're like, okay, well, the first thing we have to do is get oriented with what sort of institutional understanding you guys already have on board. What is it that you've already learned? We have to start based on what you know because you're the experts in your business, and then we'll take it from there. And not invariably, but much of the time, we would go digging and find out that they had like 20 reports on this subject that they'd already commissioned, from your Gartners or your Foresters or whatever, your Boston Consulting Group or whatever. And they'd just forgotten about them. They didn't even remember it was there. It's like they have libraries and they never go into them. And they have an institutional thing of binge and purge. Some new guy comes in and he says, we have to save huge amounts of money. So what we're going to do is purge. We're going to barf all this stuff that we used to keep in-house out, and we're going to job it out to contractors. And then you have other people who come, perhaps after that phase, and they say, no, what we have to do is binge. We have to bring it all in-house. We shouldn't be paying these people outside the house. We should do it internally ourselves. And it's binge and purge. It's like bulimia and no institutional memory. Now, I'm bringing this up because it has to do with culture. Culture is about institutional identity. And that's why one of the classic images of culture is the column that stands. Look at the etymology of stead, steady, stay, stand. Even like when I used to do editing, you come through and you make a red mark to change something, and then you're like, no, I don't want to change it. Never mind, I should leave it right where it is. They write in the margin Latin phrase stet, which means let it stand. To stay, institution, a thing that has been instituted. It has been set up and will stay. Like Solon's rotating cylinders of the law, like a stele that has, a legal code on it. It must be raised and it must stand. It must not fall over. For a thing to be raised and stand and not fall over, it must stay. It must be relatively lasting, which means it must extend beyond a given generation. That's continuity, cultural continuity. But it only works when it moves across generations, which is why the enemies or the opponents are so interested in disconnecting generational cohorts one from the other. But to really get after culture, you have to understand that you must continue, you must ensure that your column remains standing, and that the marks upon it, the images, the reliefs, the text must remain, and that we must be able to read and understand it. That's the trick. And so people think about culture, well, let's do this, let's do that. I think to myself immediately, well, how can we connect the past with the present, and thereby connect it all to a vision of the future? And I don't see much of that kind of thinking. What I see with people who are thinking about how to tackle things culturally is very much the idea of some new CEO has come in, and the idea is that we have to do something. We have to show the stakeholders that we're getting in there, and we're going to increase shareholder value. We're going to do something new. We're going to change it up, and they don't even know what came before. It's like a friend of mine told me. He was sitting in Prague in the 90s, and he was sitting with this guy who's European of some kind. I think he was actually Czech. And how do you tell the story? The guy looked up and he said, "Oh my God, I have this great idea. What if we sliced the bread and then bagged it and sold it?" Because he was off in Eastern Europe. Now, I don't know. This is an apocryphal story. Maybe it's bullshit. Maybe they've always had sliced bread in, what was at the time? Czechoslovakia, I don't know, but the way the story got told, it was funny. He reinvented sliced bread because they had loaves of bread and you had to cut it yourself, And he was like, what if we took it and we sliced it and we put it in a bag and we sold it that way? And everyone at the table from the West was like, sorry, man, it's been around for a while. In that respect, people who come in and want to do things culturally on the dissident right, I don't think they really take stock of what's already in their storehouses, what they already have as a heritage from the past. And that I think is really the most important thing that I want to get across, and I think it ties neatly to what I was talking about before in response to the question about a symbolic language. I'm sorry, I'm always looking over this direction because that's where I've got my notes on screen. So, steady, stay, stand, and thereby form the stead, the strong point atop a hill where a chieftain gathers there with his thralls. A few more ideas. Here's just some loose ideas that I throw up for that discussion with Unwashed that never came up. These are much more incidental, occasional, off the cuff kind of ideas. I am not going to mention martial law, goddammit. These are much more off the cuff ideas, and these are just sort of bite-sized. You can chew on them and think them through or whatever. But I want them to be understood against that background that I just talked about, which was the drink. The background of stead, stay, steady, stand, raise the column, ensure that it will not fall. This is frankly why they're trying to push over our statues. But anyway, here are a few ideas. One, gentlemen's clubs. I think that the time has arrived for gentlemen's clubs. I think members of the dissident right should form proper gentlemen's clubs that are very particular about their membership. And I think there's all kinds of potential there. It's a club. It's not a political party. It's not a hate group. It's a gentleman's club. And not the kind that you have to go into and stick folded dollar bills into women's garters. That just occurred to me the other night. I think the time has come for a gentleman's club with all that goes with that. Yes, anyway, that's one idea. Another one, educational programs. I was watching Anteos talk to JF about some aspects of the French Revolution. I believe it was on the directorate. And, I'm learning a lot from listening to him talk about it because he's focused on it. It was never my big period of history to focus upon. But I knew, much of the general outlines there. And it was just surprising to me looking at the chat and the rest that very few people knew anything about it. Like, I watched JF, and this isn't to chisel away at JF. I like him. I enjoy talking to him very much. I've been a guest on his show, so it's not about that. But it was just shocking to me to see someone who's very well educated in his own domain, who was like hearing for the first time that a bunch of French radicals really created communism, not Jews. And I was like, shouldn't everybody know that? Why are we not having more? Why are we not having more discussion of this? Why are we not having more studies that or discussions that people can participate in and learn about that? And so that caused me to think. I've seen a couple people on Twitter. One just started following me today, and one has been following me for a few weeks now, who show a real interest in education and in restoring the quality of our education and doing some things privately, even online, that will make that hopefully will carry us forward to a better situation as regards our education. So in addition to gentlemen's clubs, I think there's all kinds of things that can be done with setting up classes. You know, people will now go and sort of graze or browse. You know, they'll go and look online, and this interests me or that interests me, and they'll poke at this, that, or the other thing. But it would be nice to see sort of like basic educational stuff put forward online, not coming from the left, and it doesn't have to be homeschooling. It's where people who are on the, for example, dissident right get together to edumificate their asses. So perhaps that is a thing that is worth considering too. Another one that I like for fooling around with culture is our old tradition of memento mori. I've put a number of little, Twitter memes up there trying to reintroduce memento mori. It's very much a part of our old traditions. It is very much something associated with European heritage across much of Europe. It's very much part of our Christian heritage to remember death, the judgment that follows, and all the rest. But it goes back even further to the idea of, if it's not going to be that you live immortally and are judged well by God, then there's at least the idea that you would be taken up and sit at the right hand of one of the gods. And if nothing else, you would, for example, be remembered based upon the idea of your fama, your fame, gignosco, known, nobilitas, to be known. And so, in remembering death, well, I mean, you can come at it from any number of directions with a contemporary memento mori campaign. You could have where one I just saw today on Twitter was somebody saying something like, I'm telling you, degeneracy is a lot of fun. Well, there's an answer. Remember that you're eventually going to be dead, And is this the beginning and the end of what you wish to have done with the coin of your life that that can only be spent once? Or look at the idea of youth and death. If you want to reach out to young people, I remember my own period of being a lad, and I was all over the English metaphysical poets. I was all into goth, though we didn't call it goth back then. It was death rock, pallor and black hair and crucifixes in graveyards, because it's an understanding and awareness that you come to as you get to a certain age, coming out of adolescence, that where you recognize your mortality to some extent. There are many more tricks up the sleeve of fate and fortune, but adolescents are interested in that. I think people who are coming out of adolescence would be very interested in the impressions that could be made with a proper memento mori campaign, particularly if you put a spin on it. Somebody just said Misfits. The Crimson Ghost. I want your skull. I'm tone deaf. What was it? Bottle lying on her bed, face all turning blue. Could it have been the Kennedys? Sorry, I shouldn't have gone anywhere with that. There's another way that you could take a look at this idea of memento mori, which is remember death, but remember death from the perspective of the death of nations, the death of whole peoples. I think memento mori could be just like, it can be huge on the so-called dissident right. It just has to be approached in the right way. And then you could knit it together so it's got all this contemporary relevance, and yet it winds back through history with all these other strands that anyone who went digging into it might find out about. That's another idea. Okay, what else do I have here? I have dance nights. Man, let me talk about dance. Oh, man. I tried to mention this kind of thing to Unwashed. He's a cool kid, so he's doing things with DJ events and that kind of thing. And it's very cool. That has its whole side of things. And I very much dig the vial thing that he's involved in. I think it's super effective. I think it's intelligent. I think the time is right for it. So I'm not digging at him. But traditional dances, like I found old videos of the Welsh dancing with clogs. You know, I've been into flamenco and the rest. I've been lucky enough to date some ballerinas, and I've seen what kind of physique and musculature and grace and flexibility. I mean, it's insane what it does for you. Or just take a look at, you know, how long somebody like Fred Astaire lived and was still able to get around capably. You know, it does so much for your grace, your speed, your balance, accuracy in your movement. I think a great deal of it can be carried over into fighting. Take a look at, you know, Lomachenko, famous for his footwork, and one of the things that he studied early on was Ukrainian dance. You know, and these dances are tied to our cultures, and in particular, I think that there's just a huge potential in terms of singles and young people. I mean, there's just, man, when you is this woman I was very into at one point, and she was doing a live performance, and I remember this was when she finally decided that she was going to spend a little bit of time with me. She finally had been convinced that I might be the one to fiddle about with. And she was up on stage performing. I happened to be there that night in the audience, and when a woman just dances beautifully and then like stops in the middle of some dramatic motion and makes eye contact with you, you know, you're kind of like, mm-hmm. I mean, the same kind of thing happens with women who see a man who's accomplished at dancing. And I'm not talking about, you know, shaking your ass like a Brazilian. I'm talking about European dances that involve restraint. For all that they'll have explosive movements that are very impressive and athletic and all these other things. But I just, there's an enormous amount of potential wound up in collective dancing, where people have an opportunity to dance individually, but also in couples, and then in couples, but in groups, but not just one or the other of these things, or one among these things, all of them in a set, so that you can see the individual person who is capable of making that statement individually in their dance and being the center of attention in that way. You can see couples who do it, and in which case it's always a good idea, gentlemen, to not try to dance your best, try to serve as a setting for the movements of the ladies, so that they can be shown to greatest advantage. And then in groups, you know, whether it's, you know, line dancing or square dancing or whatever it is. In particular, traditional dances, but that can be reinterpreted in any number of ways. I mean, I can't even imagine what you can do with a pair of wooden clogs with somebody who is badass. So anyway, that's an idea too. Traditional dances, setting up dance nights, getting together with your friends and learning a traditional dance and bringing males and females to do it. I mean, the least of things that you will achieve with that is that you'll keep the people who know those traditional dances of yours alive and fed, and hold out some promise that what they know how to do will be carried forward into the future, instead of just, you know, twerking in drag queen story hour. So that's something to think about. Another one that I hope to talk about at some length later is parades. Now, hopefully I'll be able to get together with a friend of mine who has looked at this. He's studied ethnomusicology. I've looked at stuff, you know, when I talk about animals patrolling territorial borders, and he talks about ethnomusicology, where processions, because he studied processions in Spain, Santa Semana processions in Spain, also Rocio processions, and you find out how the rhythm is used to get people marching in step. It's much like cadences, you know, the playing of a drum, the rhythm that gets people to move together, the way in which rhythm is what holds performers together, the way in which a certain kind of rhythm is what holds a sports team together. Rhythm It allows people to organize better in space and act more effectively as a group, along with things like, trumpets and flags and banners. But parades are very interesting in that respect. And by getting groups of people together to engage in parades, especially things like traditionally like you have in the UK with beating the bounds, or, it can be very inflammatory, but things like, Irish nationalists versus, the House of Orange, green or orange people marching around their different territorial borders in order to mark and claim them. I think these are very important too, and present all sorts of opportunities that we should look into. I mean, if you want to talk about, for example, having a major impact on people, you get a group of folks out to have a parade, not a protest. Everybody thinks of it as a protest. That's the problem. They think, well, we'll get out on the street and they'll see how many of us there are and it'll be a protest. Meh, protest. No, have it be a procession, not a protest. Now, they tried it in the past with things like tiki torches, which to me just seemed like shockingly stupid because it was just asking for it. If it's a tiki torch, then they'll go back to, black and white footage from the 1940s and they'll all, throw swastikas at you like shuriken. However, it's very, very simple. You can get the same effect as you would with a torch-lit parade with a bunch of men chanting. You can get the same effect, but very calm, and no one would ever be able to touch you if you simply went out silently with candles. Then it would be a vigil. You'd have the same light, which is powerful. It creates that amber glow and makes you feel like you're a part of something, But in silence, not with adolescent, testosterone. Instead, silence to send a message as everyone passes by quietly. Or if you're going to go in another direction, I see somebody mention marching bands. That's another thing, is marching with music. I looked into that quite a bit. Turns out that European marching bands really emerged as a result of Ottoman instrumentation, and that the military marching bands were pulled from the mehter, which were Turkish marching bands. Anyway, parades, processions, ritual processions, and exploring those rather than something as superficial and stupid as protests. Like, understand the real potential inherent in a group of people marching together in a certain direction. It's deeply rooted in our psyches. Whether you take a look, for example, at the way in which animals want to patrol the borders of their territory, and they do so like a dog. It's waiting for you to carry the leash forward, and it wants to bolt out the door so it can patrol its route. It can see what's been happening there. It can mark its territory, show its dominion by following that route regularly in order to patrol it and claim it. That's what they're doing with these things in Northern Ireland, where one group marches one way, another group marches another way. And they're tied to religion. It goes to peregrination, right? Pilgrims, like heading out to Compostela with a seashell on your hat. It even goes down to a stress response from human beings, because you'll see after the plague hit Europe, they had rogational processions where they'd march around the cities flagellating themselves. It comes from the idea when there's terrible stress, back when we were halfway into being men from being animals. When something bad happens, the animals get together and as a group go the hell somewhere else. So it's very deeply ingrained on a number of biological levels, and these have all been developed in different ways across a whole time span of our cultures. And so parades, processions, I think are important. Another one is holidays, marking the calendar. I mean, that's what Christians did when they superseded pagan holidays. That's what the utopian worshippers of many one, commies and others, have done. They try to take over the calendar. I mean, now we've got Mother's Day, we've got International Women's Day. I mean, there are all these things marking time and space, to come all the way back around to that stuff I was talking about earlier with the origin of esoteric traditions. Category and instance, measurement of space, calendars, territory, borders, parades, holidays, rituals, all of this stuff. I mean, I've studied it extensively, and yet what we see for the most part is protests and memes. Protests and memes. I have nothing against memes, and sometimes protests make sense, quote-unquote protests, protests. But we have this whole toolkit, And most of the people approach this so superficially that they can't even dig down into it and exploit it properly. Instead, a bunch of, leftist academics in their ivory towers get into all this recondite shit, and like the Frankfurt School, they issue their little directives that exploit all of these things that I'm talking about, while a lot of people on the right are like, well, I'm doing memes, I formed a political party, I'm protesting, all those things have their place. I'm not saying don't do it, but good God, man, why fight with one arm tied behind your back instead of having recourse to all the weapons in your cultural arsenal that have been around for so very long? All right, a few little ones here. Historical anti-immigration movements are a thing that everybody should be looking into. Like, you go through it. Like, you get together as a group and you say, all right, I'll take this book and look into this period, and you take that period, and you do research here. All these different, if it's know-nothings or if it's whatever period it is where you had an anti-immigration movement, like, go see what other people did and see what good ideas they have, see what they screwed up on, so that you don't have to repeat their mistakes. The old Santayana quote, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, or some such. I mean, it's like organized together, work as a group. I mean, there's a whole category of shit that, or a whole nother subject that I want to cover in this respect, which is like, make a plan. Like, make a plan that serves as the basis to make a plan. It's not just that you plan, it's that you know that you're going to have to do certain things in order to form a plan. So you have to do things like, for example, say that here's the end goal, we've agreed on that. That's a huge amount of work. And then there's the idea, how do we get there? And then there's like, well, what step really has to come first? Do we really want to do this first, or do we want to do this second? It's like cooking a dish. If you don't know how to cook, you don't know about the business of, having to do things in a particular order so it doesn't all fall apart. How often have you seen people say, yes, this is our goal, but in order to make that happen, first we must do this, and then we must do this, and then we must do this in order to have the possibility of doing this? And how many of them have contingency plans who've thought through all the different things that could go wrong along that sequence of events? The vast majority of the people who claim to be strategists, I'm just like, how the fuck are you a strategist? Like saying, I want to do that. That's not a plan. The sharp pencils among those who actually make plans, who think beyond the horizon that I talked about of like 3 years for institutional, schizophrenia, who can think far enough that they're doing something besides, sprinkling pine seeds on the ground in order to, grow a few trees in a 20-year period and harvest them, who instead plant black walnut because they're planning across generations. Their enemies can't even properly fight with them because the people who plan across generations are fighting on a game board, or playing the game on a game board that their opponents don't even see. So, yeah, the sequence, choosing what your goal is, agreeing on it, stress testing it, an argument about what might happen here, there, or there, and then the idea of setting it up ordinally so that it happens in stages that build upon each other. For example, deciding that, yes, I want to get to X goal over here, but before we get there, what we should do is choose the smallest thing first, because we know we need to gather people together and we need to establish morale, which means no matter what we do, the first thing out of the gate has got to be a driving success so that everyone goes, yes, we can do this, right? We can do this. We can make the difference. So you have to have a success, and you have to have it be seen to be a success, which means you have to choose very carefully the sequence. And then based on that success, if it happens, then you can move to the next thing. People do not plan that way, or young people certainly don't. I wish older people would. And that's part of the thing of disconnecting the younger generations from the older ones, to come back to the same old joke. I won't talk about martial law, but the young bull and the old bull at the top of the hill. The young bull looks down and says, let's run down there and fuck a cow. And the old bull says, no, let's walk down and fuck all of them. And that's a lot of what we're missing. Like, I don't want to crawl up anybody's ass. It's not my place. I'm not in the UK. But for example, just looking at this whole business with Patriotic Alternative going after For Britain, I'm like, congratulations, you picked the group of people who are the least unlike you compared to all the other alternatives. I'm not saying they're the same, but they're the least unlike you. and y'all are choosing to use your energy to go after them, when they could be left to do their thing and they would create a distraction for your opponents at the same time. Anyway, it's stuff like this. I'm like, is there at any point at which like a proper general stands at the table with his staff officers and makes a plan and works out contingencies and has thought the whole thing through and even has all sorts of side plans, knowing that even though you've thought it all through, no plan survives first contact with the enemy? I don't see a bit of it. I don't see a bit of it anywhere, and certainly not from the people who claim to be leaders of movements. I mean, the best thing that they can do is like, you know, choose one or two things that they say are important, and then you see, you know, only the vaguest of trajectories established that are supposed to assist them in getting to where it is they say they want to go. A few last quick things. I already covered a lot of this. You know, there's lots of stuff from branding and marketing and business. You know, so there's things like strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, which they call a SWOT assessment. You know, I've been involved in so much of this stuff where they're making plans, and in many cases for years out. I mean, some of these big companies, they're like, oh yeah, we know that this is coming and this is coming, but our issue is that we see, you know, X, Y, or Z on the horizon as a threat, so we have to plan for about 5 years out. Now, usually these are closely held private companies, not publicly owned. So you have someone up at the helm who's like, no, I want to steer this ship over a period of 20 years. I'm not worried about 3 to 5, right? But there are all kinds of lessons out there from the world of business, and I just don't see people doing that. I don't see people planning that way. Now, I see somewhere here where somebody writes, the problem with organization is FBI terror lists. Only if you try to do it secret squirrel. Do it in the openly. I use my own name. I don't get on Telegram because I don't want to be doing anything that's secret or hidden. I don't even want to seem to be doing anything that's secret or hidden. Every conversation I've had with anybody, it's essentially public. I talk about all this. I'm public right now talking about this. You know, even if I'm talking to someone, you know, in a DM or something, I assume it's public. It's entirely public all the time. You know, the problem with organizations is FBI terror lists. Yeah, if you're trying to sneak around and not get caught in a time when there's absolute transparency for everyone in government looking at their subjects. No, do it openly. Say it openly. Assert it openly. Make it a public project. Much like with, you know, parades and processions rather than protests. You know, are you going to, you know, be taken down by the FBI for a protest? Yeah, maybe. You going to be taken down by the FBI for a cultural parade? Not if you handle it right. So, yes, I'm not going to go way down that road. But anyway, there's all sorts of things like strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threat. There's all kinds of stuff with branding and the rest. I had to spend a considerable amount of time getting my head around thinking strategically and choosing carefully where you were going to put your energy. That's another thing. Everybody's like, well, how much energy does it really use for Patriotic Alternative to go after For Britain? Well, I'm like, how much do you have? Last I checked, you're not like, you know, the king of the hill with all the power and the resources. Last I checked, all these people who are trying to do anything about the problems we face, they're weak. It's easy to destroy the movements in childbirth. They have limited resources. They're under attack on all sides. So they're like, well, how much energy does it take? I'm like, man, choose where to use your energy and choose wisely. Because in many cases, you only get like, you know, one chance to strike, metaphorically speaking. Anyway, I've covered that enough. What else do we have here? And I'm not trying to make this sound like a Glenn Ross pep talk. I am certainly no expert, and I have nothing against Patriotic Alternative. Frankly, I don't even have much against For Britain. It just seems like a waste of everybody's energy all around. And I think if people were planning across a trajectory that went further, planning even across generations, then we'd be much more formidable, and we would in fact be operating on the actual game board. The actual game board is across generations. The reason that those who afflict us, and that's a plural, different groups, the many different groups that afflict us, in my opinion, have gotten into the position where they're able to do so effectively because they plan across generations. Meanwhile, we're like, well, what can we do this week? Or what are we aiming for in the next election cycle? What can we get done in the next 3 to 5 years? Thoughts, ideas, a few suggestions. And I think I have come to the end of this whole period of mine of covering the stuff that I had notes upon, which means we are now at a point where we can talk about, or I can talk about or answer questions that y'all throw down for me, and I will be happy to do so. Now, there's a little bit of delay with me talking, so, in terms of what I say and when it gets to you guys. So I will be waiting to take a look at questions in the comments. Please do put an @Semiagog into it so that I will see it in here. Otherwise, it just goes by in the comments and discussion. And I will answer specific questions from the folks who are kind enough to be here this evening checking out my talking. I see Darkest Sky saying Semiagog organizing the UK right is like herding cats. Yeah, and I imagine it's much the same thing here. The trick for that is you have to find a banner that when you raise it, everyone wants to salute. And then you can begin to get somewhere. But you have to make decisions about what everyone can get behind. And that's challenging. I would have written you a shorter note, but I didn't have time. Everybody looks at like a brand like Nike. You have to understand brands. There are 3 different ways that they're communicating with you. One is a non-linguistic mark, which is the logo type, and don't allow the use of the term logo in that word to make you think that it's word-based. Of course, logos is word, right? So they say a logo, and you think it's like Sony is a logo, properly speaking, because it's a written version of this word using a particular typeface. But we use logo more broadly. It's basically the non-linguistic mark. So for Nike, it's a swoosh. So there'll be a non-linguistic mark, the symbol, and then there will be a name, Nike, right? And then there will be a tagline of some kind that contextualizes it. So the symbol of the swoosh speaks across linguistic groups. It has a sense of movement. It's associated loosely with the winged sandals of victory. Nike herself, the word means victory. And then down at the bottom, I don't know if it's changed, but once upon a time it said, just do it. And people are, they're like, oh, just do it. That's cute. They must have just come up with that. No, it takes time. It takes an enormous amount of time to come up with an effective tagline like that. And so what I'm getting at is that if you don't want to have to herd cats, you have to raise a banner that speaks to people. It should speak to them with a non-linguistic sign, with a name that has meaning, and a tagline that contextualizes all of it and serves to motivate them. And that takes branding work. You have to sit down and you have to be like, well, what matters to them? What matters most? How can we show that? How can we be better and different, B and D, better and different than those who are also jockeying to take position? So there's quite a bit to it. It's just that people don't plan. I mean, they plan in ways that are like, meh. I've just seen enough of people who make huge amounts of money from planning in advance properly to have a sense of what is really involved with all of this, and I don't see many people doing it. Now, to be fair, I'm sure there's a whole lot of it going on behind the scenes, so I don't think it's not happening, but many people out there should be, I think, maybe doing a better job than they are, without naming any names. And I'm not speaking about the UK in particular. It's the whole world, US, UK, everywhere else. All right, so do we have some questions here? Arthur Mather says, Semiagog thoughts on Current 93. I like the album Hourglass for Diana. And there are a couple of tracks on the portable Altamont by, Since Disappointment and Despair, the vainness of all hopes declare. I like a few of their albums. The problem is that David Tibet, though he had sort of his own vibe, and it comes across, and there's a lot that I like about it. In the early days, he's pretty close to it being as tone deaf as I am. So there's a lot of stuff that's out of tune, especially when they're playing any kind of fretless instrument. So there's all kinds of big musical question marks, but it gets better over time. and I still like Hourglass for Diana. It was what turned me on to metaphysical poetry, so-called. And I corresponded with him briefly. He was famous back in the day that if you wrote him a letter in David Tibet, he would write back, and I can attest to that. I wrote him a few times when I was living in Turkey, and he wrote back. He seems like an interesting guy, but I kind of fell out of that. I don't listen to it that much anymore unless I have this late night thing of going back through my old music. Casey says, do you think Tim's correct that indictments may be coming for Obama and Clinton? Yeah, I think it could happen. There's certainly stuff pointed at Obama. I'm very confident that we're going to be seeing it for somebody like Comey and for Brennan, these kind of people. And I think it's certainly possible that we'll see it hit Obama and Clinton. I'm probably not quite as sanguine about the prospects as Tim is, though. But we'll see. I mean, it's changing and changing fast. All right. What do we have here? Emoryahi says the ability to organize has the potential to be evil. The priests of Egypt were gay because they recruited pharaohs to be an example of the living God before man. That only a gay man would think of. Okay. Doomer Tier says, Semiagog talk about Freemasons and why they modeled their image on the Babylonian fertility god. I wasn't aware that Freemasons model their image on a Babylonian fertility god. You'd have to tell me what image it is that you're talking about there in terms of the model. And I'll hasten to add, I'm no specialist on Freemasons. Though the idea of organization of space, architects as people who establish patterns that shape society, and Freemasons are some themes that I hope to be bringing up in an upcoming stream I will be participating in with Academic Agent and others. Very interestingly, some who are architects, and even more importantly, some who are structural engineers. And I'm looking very much forward to that. That's going to be on the 29th, I think. So yeah, tell me what you mean about Freemasons, and maybe I'll answer it quickly if I can. But there will be more talk about Freemasons, if I have anything to do with it, in this upcoming Academic Agent stream on architecture. All right. King Salmonfish says, Semiagog, prefrontal cortex grew out of motor cortex. Our thoughts die so we don't have to. Action patterns, timeline navigation. Zen teaches that when planning, there's always infinite variables. Well, I don't... okay. It seems like a statement. I'm not really sure there's a question there that I can answer. And I don't see any further questions yet, so we'll see if a few more appear. I'm going to scroll back and see if there's anything I missed here early on from the discussion that might be marked with my name. We are here and we must find out whether... Oh, we have Arthur Matthews, Semiagog. When are you next talking with Unwashed? I do not know. I have not received an invitation to speak with him again, so we shall see. Okay, that's as far back as that goes. I don't see any questions. Let's see if any new ones have come in. C says, role importance of multilingualism in the dissident right. Is there any? I don't know what to say about that. I'm barely bilingual. I am able to speak Turkish passably, conversationally. Like if the vocabulary gets technical, or everybody's talking too fast, I have limits to how well I can follow it. So I'm sort of bilingual. For an American, I'm definitely bilingual. Most people who claim in the United States to be bilingual think that because they can read, a bathroom sign in Spanish, that they're bilingual. And all I've learned from it, I think, bears upon the making of more formidable individuals, more so than it does perhaps the trajectory of a given movement. So I think the short answer to that would be that I think being bilingual or multilingual always entails a certain amount of opening up of your horizons culturally, because you learn how people talk and say things. I mean, if you really want to understand the German, you have to understand this whole concept of Schweinhund, And there are many things like that. If you want to understand people who come from the Balkans or the Eastern Mediterranean, you've got to understand backgammon. It's not chess. They like to gamble on things and make a show of doing so. So there's many ways in which having the ability to speak more than one language means that you've sort of opened up to multiple cultures. And while I'm not here to push for a type of across-the-board syncretism, I think that you can really only come to know your own culture properly or with any depth if you've been forced to kind of step outside of it. It's like the old business was Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand and I'll move the world. Well, the only way you can position a lever long enough, let's leave aside the whole role of the fulcrum, which isn't mentioned in any of this, but you need a place to stand from the outside in order to move it. And you have to step outside in order to understand it, and I think that's important. But, Americans are the worst ones to ask about being multilingual. We're such lazy shit. I'm watching this guy, Anteos, talk to JF, and, he's popping stuff out in French. Obviously speaks French fairly well. Obviously he's speaking German as his native language, and then I'm listening to him speak in English, and I'm perfectly capable of telling that his English is excellent, and I'm just like, we're so fucked. We're so lazy, man. The education in the United States is just so awful. Just awful. Now, mind you, we are, it's the lingua franca today, English is. And so we have the advantage of, like Rome, back when Latin was all the rage. We can afford to sort of dominate speaking just our one language. But I think, I think it would be better if more of us had understandings of different cultures and languages, insofar as it would make us more formidable participants in all that's going on, and it would help us to better understand our own cultures. Arthur Mathers says, Semiagog, have you read any of Stephen Skinner's work on magic? Well, I have not. I'm sorry to say, I have never even heard of him, as a matter of fact. Baggins, NZ, which I assume stands for New Zealand. It says, Semiagog, have you started a garden yet? Do you think it's worth planting pine trees, etc., with plans in mind of manufacturing the timber? I'm not going to plant pine because the roots apparently go down very deep, but they're not steady. They get knocked over in the wind easily. They're basically for paper and cheap lumber. If I were planting trees, I'd want to do it out on a big enough piece of land that it could help to feed the wildlife. I'd want to get some hybrid chestnuts, as Tim is constantly smacking me about the head and shoulders, telling me to do. Muscadine vines, basically planting things that the animals are going to enjoy in order to create that whole system. And of course, when the animals eat it, they crap the seeds out and the trees come up elsewhere. And there's that Japanese guy with his crazy theory. I keep forgetting his name. Tim just told me again. My old girlfriend in Turkey was big into him too, so was her dad. He's a Japanese guy who's got the idea of not really proper agriculture, like you wrap a seed in a strange kind of ball and just leave it on the ground and you let things grow up. It's more how someone who manages a forest deals with plants rather than someone who has a regimented field. But I'm very ignorant about those things, and having to do with biology and nature and botany and plants and all that. But I hope to learn more about it in the future when I retire to the forest. Fiend J says, riffing further on the bilingual versus tri or more lingual, English as a universal common language makes further language learning difficult. Yes, it does. It does. That's only half an excuse. I mean, obviously, you know more than one language. All the damn Scandinavians have such good training in English early on. Yeah. Now, Lakeva has a question, but he or she put a space before it. I'll see if I can read it so it didn't come up as orange because of the space between the at and the s. But let's see. Can Christianity be encouraged to quit avoiding the economic, political, and education systems instead of following John Nelson Darby's bizarre, unbiblical, defeatist eschatology? I'm not familiar with John Nelson Darby. I've got vast areas of ignorance related to Christianity in general. Basically, the question, if I were to rephrase it, so far as I understand it, is, can Christianity please get back into the fight where it matters? Maybe, but I mean, they've been as subverted as, in large part, as any other organization. It seems like there's still a pretty hardcore crew of Catholics. who don't like the current commie pope. But I don't know, and I don't know enough, for example, about like the Eastern Orthodox. I know that's very popular with people on the dissident right, but I've seen any number of Orthodox churches around where I live, and they just, refugees welcome type signs and all that kind of shit. So I don't know, man. I really don't. Okay, where am I lost here? This damn thing. Okay, there we go. Waldo Ludowski says, Semiagog, should we assume the lodge tradition of organization? I don't know. I don't know enough about Freemasons and lodges and how they're organized. I mean, if you mean in terms of grades and ranks and secrecy, I don't know. There are probably things that can be taken from it that are useful, but there are certain things where, it's kind of like the old Heraclitus thing. You cannot step twice into the same river, so I'm not entirely sure that attempting to go backwards is going to be the best way. So yeah, ignorance prevents me from offering any further comment besides that. Max Danger says English is an evolutionarily superior language. It has its moments, but mainly because it steals from so many other languages. Like, I think German is very interesting because you can just cobble elements together and make big new giant words. There's a lot about, plus German has the declensions that allow you to play games with word order that creates subtexts and the rest. Yeah. The best thing is to hang out with people who are, masters of their native language, but who speak yours too and help you with it. That's the thing, man. So much good learning happens side by side. Hanging out with people who are interesting and knowledgeable that are just your peers and friends. And that's so much more difficult to do remotely in some ways. I mean, there's a lot that makes it easier. I wouldn't have heard of any of you, and none of you would have heard of me for the most part. We're all this not online, but there's much to be said for, living around each other. All right, where are we now? Now we've got another one from Fiend J. Yes, exactly. So we don't learn a third language, and others don't learn Norwegian. We don't let them. Yes. What did I learn in Norwegian, or some of it? Blitt bit av en horn. Ha en tveilig kveld. I can't remember if that's Norwegian or Swedish. That's all I can fucking remember. That's it. Ha en tveilig kveld. Have a good evening. The Swedes have this strange sound they make with their voice. This strange little voice they make. The Swedes make a strange sound. I can't even do it. It's almost like it's this kind of sound they do. When they make some of their noises. I don't know. I don't understand any of it. And the Danes sound like they have potatoes in their mouths, and all of them say yes by going... Weird fuckers. I call them the West Germans. The so-called Germans are just the East Germans. The West Germans are, more interesting, a little more. Yes. Anyway, enough about that. King Salmonfish, Semiagog, how did Trump defeat a multi-generational entrenched long-term planning system? Fucking winging it is an even more powerful method. The best laid plans of mice and men, COVID graphs. I don't know, man. I tend to disagree with you there. I think there was huge amounts of planning and preparation for Trump, and that he's the front face on something that is much more organized and involves a lot more people having come together to make it happen. That's just my view. Now, that said, like we talked about, I said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You said the best laid plans of mice and men. I agree. What else we got here? Max Danger says, Semiagog, how about starting a religion, a sect of Christianity? I don't see it happening. It might be Akira Miyawaki to Baggins. Yes, maybe that's it. I can't remember. Religions have to burst upon the scene, at least the seed of it, the core. You can have somebody like a Saul of Tarsus who comes along later, changes his name to Paul, and organizes it as an institution. But there has to be that spontaneous sort of Christ figure, I feel, for it to actually be a religion. And so, just starting it. Now you can wait with all your equipment ready for the moment that the right thing appears and try to do it. I think if you just try to create it out of whole cloth, even based upon previous traditions, the best you're going to do is something like the Baha'i, And that basically just seems like the British trying to create a new globally more friendly version of a Shiite Islam, you know, and it just totally feels contrived. Now, I don't know, maybe there are some Baha'i believers who really are moved emotionally by it, but I think if you've got huge state and intelligence service money behind you, you could maybe come up with something along the lines of the Baha'is, but it's never going to have that. It's not going to cause, you know, Christians to allow themselves to be eaten alive by lions to prove their faith. It's not going to cause, you know, crazy ass Arabs led by an epileptic camel driver to come rolling out of the Arabian Peninsula to take over Byzantium. You know, there's got to be an actual spark there. Redeemer's telling me to look up here. He didn't add his comments. I'll see if I can find it quickly. Perhaps I can. Judge wigs and beards tracing back to Babylonia. Yeah, but the Masons were just wearing wigs and that sort of thing, as everybody else in the culture was, the males anyway. And so I can't see the wearing of wigs as being something specifically coming from Masons. But perhaps there's some odd dimension of the history of all of this that I'm unaware of, in which case you can disabuse me of my ignorant ideas. Arthur Mather says, Semigog, do you play any instruments? Yeah, I play a drum and do rhythm a bit because I have to for the flamenco dance, and I played taiko drums for a while, never particularly well. So yeah, I still have I have 2 cajones, and after my father died, I inherited his flamenco guitar, and I've got a couple acoustic guitars. I've got 3 guitars now, even though I can't play any of them. They just end up in the closet. Yes, at a minimum rhythm, but something with pitch and color is probably the best. Yeah. Yes. Instruments. Good thing. Fiend J says Swedes are from Mars. Man, when I was in Stockholm, I went there for a conference that was hosted at the Sveriges Riksdag, and I just remember seeing these just sour-faced women. You know, there'd be this guy pushing a pram with a kid in it, and 4 paces in front of him would be this sour-faced woman. I remember buying a beer at a bar, and a Swedish woman would serve it to me, and if you even smiled at them, there was a hint that in smiling you were trying to hit on them, and therefore, I mean, it was just short of hissing at me. The women there were just, I don't know what it is. I mean, I had a Norwegian girlfriend back in the day when I lived in Turkey, and she was, it was more like party girl type thing. But something happened, because that with the Shashti. That was back in the second half of the 90s, and it wasn't like that. But now something changed there, and it's just they all have this horrible, mouthed puritanical shit going on. They just all seem like a bunch of man-haters. No offense to Swedish women who aren't man-haters. I'm sure there are a few of them out there. Or, I don't know, possibly there are a few of them out there. Max Danger, Semigog, intersectionality is a secular proto-religion complete with child sacrifice. Well, I have explored many of those ideas on my own, as you will see in a clip entitled The New Religion. Alright, what else here? Do we have further questions? Do we have any further questions here? Does anyone else have a question for me that I can try to respond to? I will look back and see if there's anything I missed. We've got about 21 minutes left. I think I will wrap this at 10:30. So if you guys have questions, please do keep them coming. Hopefully I haven't missed those. From anybody who asked and got passed over. I do love my old-time channel followers who have been around since the earliest days. Let me see here. What else do we have? Further questions for us? There we are. It looks like a pile of them. Max Danger says, it is a mammalian instinct for the female to chase away males out of their territory. I don't know. It depends on where they are in the arc of their development. If it's just a straightforward mammalian instinct, then how come so many women in so many places, so many other countries, and so many different periods of time that I've seen in my life were nothing like that at all. I mean, I'll grant you, when I was younger, I frisked about as an attractive little lad trying to get myself into trouble quite a bit more. So I can see where, the women would, look at you and they're like, you're old now, I'm not as interested. That makes sense to me. But to go to this one country and have it be this dour Puritan feeling, this post-social justice, secular Puritanism, Sweden has something very specific, some specific problem of its own going on, or so it seems to me. King Salmon Fish says, Semiagog, we agree. I'm saying that historically people thought it through so hard that they reached the point of high wisdom. Trump is winging it and acting naturally, educatedly, with backing. Yeah, I just think there's more going on. I think there are probably even things going on where Trump is being helped and doesn't even know that he is being helped, or if he doesn't even know who by and exactly how. Baggins NZ says, Semiagog, where are your papers? You mean your papers, please? If you don't know that, if you don't, mean that, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. Fiend J says, Semiagog, what do you see as the main challenge to starting gentlemen's clubs? How to keep the women out? No problem. Just start a club and say men only. I love the idea. Just flat out say men only. I think that would be an interesting thing. I mean, I would take a look at the possibilities of, white only as well. There should be clubs where, you can set the criteria. Now, they've, of course, said that you cannot do that by law. And so I do not recommend anyone do anything illegal. But I think, if you got together with some lawyers and planned it out right, you could open up another front there, even if not necessarily win easily. Okay, what else here? Striba says, I'll have to listen to the beginning because I missed some of this. Yes, I think I addressed a specific question of yours. What was the one that was from Striba? That was aesthetics and its relation to ethics on a personal and cultural level. I couldn't handle cultural level as much, but I handled personal a bit early on. Max Danger says, Semiagog, what do you think of Q? I think Q is something put together by pro-Trump either law enforcement or intelligence or propaganda organizations designed to push the Trump message in a way that's sort of comprehensible to the vast majority of people. So, for example, it's never that there's a certain group or groups. It's never that it's commies or, or particular ethnic groups like Jews or Chinese people or something. It's all straightforward. It's just quote-unquote international criminals. And the idea is that Trump will come and take care of it, and it'll get done, and it'll be taken care of for all time, and he will have caught the criminals, and it'll be over. So you don't have to, if you take up the set of Q explanations, it's all just sort of bite-sized. You don't have to think about generations of it. It's just, maybe a generation or two, but you don't have to think about problems that have been being developed and maybe that have a certain kind of continuity from at least the French Revolution. It's just international criminals, and we'll take care of it, and they'll be put in jail, and it'll be over. I mean, I'm shorthanding it, but basically Q is sort of like a light version of finding a way to frame what's going on for the wider public that doesn't take them too far into concern or the outer fringes of paranoia, and by the same token sets everything up in such a fashion that they can expect one day to have a very simple, straightforward solution, and they won't have to worry about it anymore. How to guide on setting up a gentleman's club from Baggins. I'm not sure about that. I do not know. I'd have to give that some more thought. I haven't really properly thought it through. I mean, half the time I go downstairs in my little smoking area next to my little exhaust fan by my window, and I have my little note cards there. I'll be listening to something, and I scribble down notes. And just recently, one of them was, we need a gentleman's club, by God. I haven't thought it properly through yet. Okay, Doomertier says, Semiagog, do you think that Crete, Mesopotamia, and Mohenjo-Daro were a single European civilization and its trading colonies? No, I do not. I don't know a great deal about Mohenjo-Daro, but I've seen the so-called script of the Indus Valley, and I've looked at some of this Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and the rest. I tend to think that that was more associated with groups that are now today called Arabs. Might be tied to Mesopotamia, Crete, and Cyprus. I think Europeans got down there very early, although, there's puzzles that need to be sorted out regarding just who the quote-unquote sea peoples were. But I don't see enough cultural continuity in the material culture to assume that all those people were related. Not that, they have to be closely related, or that you have to see obvious parallels with material culture, but, I've seen no evidence of the use, for example, of the kind of bronze rapiers, essentially rapiers, long, straight, double-edged swords that you see in Crete and Thera, that's Santorini, Cyprus, way back when, once upon a time. You don't see that kind of thing in Mohenjo-Daro or Mesopotamia. I don't know. We'll see what happens with the genetic stuff, though, because the horizon is being pushed back to a considerable extent, and it appears that we'll be able to learn much more. Jem Bannister says, Semiagog, why did Bush open up the shale revolution and energy independence since he was pretty much with the globalist agenda? This must have been being pre-planned and done before Trump arrived. Yes, I think so. I think basically what happened is that different parties down along the line have recognized that at a certain point, whether you imagine that Israel will be disappeared or everything will be turned into a greater Israel, or if we'll create one large block of nations that are organized around the basic ideas of Sunni Islam, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Even people who backed the Bushes would have had to recognize that at some point, at some future point, a remaking of the Middle East would need to take place. And that remaking would entail considerable upheaval and change that would threaten energy supply lines. And so no matter what side you were on about what was supposed to come out of that transformation, you would want to make sure that you had the option, if shit got really weird, of having your energy come from somewhere else. And so I tend to think that the people behind Bush were in large part the same people behind Obama. They just play games with, the sock puppets that seem to be on different sides of the fight. And in anticipation of what has come to be known as Arab Spring, they began to put the things in place to have some sort of energy alternatives that were native in the United States. And so that tends to be how I think of it. All right, where are we now? We're on Max Danger. Semiagog, what are your thoughts on Antarctica? I don't know enough about it. I've looked at the Arctic a bit, but I have not looked closely at Antarctica. Although the Chinese are trying to get in there as well. I mean, if your question is, does it exist? Is the Earth flat? No, I think the Earth is a sphere, and that Antarctica really exists. I don't have really any opinion on what was there, perhaps before poles shifted, or whether there's civilizations hidden beneath the ice and the rest. I just don't know much about it. It seems to be a place that we're staking out now because of access to certain resources. But beyond that, I just don't know much. King Salmonfish says, Semiagog, how do you get an ex to admit to herself she loves you after she straight up told you? Emotions? Imagine it in the context of the fate of the world. Think nuclear sub-captain's wife. I have no idea what you're talking about, man. How to get an ex to admit to herself she loves you after she straight up told you? Parentheses, that she loves you? Presumably, if she said it, she's admitted it not only to herself but to you. I have to plead inability to follow the question. My apologies, sir. Semiagog, thinking of learning an ancient language. I'm sure you have been as well. If you had to pick Latin or Sanskrit. Latin, man. Sanskrit, sure, I'm sure it could be interesting, but Latin is ours. Sanskrit is much further back. Yeah, and I mean, frankly, I'm translating stuff out of Ottoman right now, because it's basically Turkish. I mean, it's Turkish. It's Ottoman Turkish. The problem is the damn alphabet, but because I studied Arabic in high school, I can sort of get by with it. It's very slow. So it's technically sort of an ancient language since it's been superseded. But yeah, I want to learn Latin, and I would learn Latin because then I can go read all the European literature that's in our canon without having to wait for it to be translated. So, yeah. Adherent of Lady Columbia says you should go on Happy Homelands. I'm not really familiar with that show. I haven't really checked it out, but I'll have a look for sure. Always willing to entertain a suggestion from Adherent of Lady Columbia, longtime channel follower. Tatia Michelle says the gun range I frequent has a gentleman's group that meet on a regular basis. Maybe the male species can spaces. I thought she meant species. Maybe male spaces can make a comeback. Yes. Well, there's, official and unofficial too. So that's the trick. Men shooting, going out to shoot. Men getting out there to shoot, get out there, shoot off a few rounds. Max Danger says, Semiagog, you are great at this. Thanks for all the answers. Thank you, Max Danger. It is my pleasure, sir. Or ma'am. Guy from V says Sanskrit is gay. I can't speak Sanskrit. You get the Indian voice and the waggy head. Semiagog, what are your thoughts on singularity or consciousness uploading? Man, I'm cybernetics and all that, and transhumanism. I'm too close. We're 9 minutes out from the end of this, so come at me with that one. I've answered a number of questions for you, so I hope you don't think that I'm dismissing you, but come at me with that one another day when I'm a little better prepared for that particular idea. Baggins, New Zealand says, Semiagog, do you think that with the great introspective scope of the internet, mankind will finally have the tools to identify the extent of his own self? No, I am no big believer in any external tools doing much of anything for human beings. Oh, Haiku Bandit's in the house. Talk about an old long-time channel follower. Hello, Miss Lady 575. It's good to see you. It's been a while. Baggins, it's this thing, we have this idea of information, and I've talked about this before. The idea of information has superseded the idea of knowledge. And so once upon a time we would talk about knowledge or wisdom, and it was something inside a person. And now we have this idea of information. And what's so frightening about it is that information surrounds us. We're surrounded by information. That's what everybody likes to say, except none of it exists. None of it exists, except insofar as it's in a person's memory, imagination, and personal awareness, unless it's been internalized. All those books, they're nothing. They don't exist until someone reads and internalizes it. It's not real. It has no existence. It's fleeting. And so, given that we live in an absolute golden age, Tim used to talk about it, other people have too. But I just took a shower, I could turn a knob and hot water comes out. I just turn the knob and it flows out of the wall. And it's safe to get it in my mouth. It won't give me dysentery. I can get into a metal bird and fly from the US to Europe in a matter of hours. We can go into space. We can send words and even images through the air. We're surrounded by things that unquestionably reveal that we're in an absolute golden age. And yet for all that, in spite of all of that, we are perhaps the most stunted and hunchbacked and miserable and repulsive people that we've ever been. I mean, you could at least make that the argument that is the case, exceptions aside. So I don't believe the interwebs are going to save us, when our own bookish traditions are insufficient to do so. Arthur Mather says, Semiagog, chat with Keith Wood someday. He's a bright kid. There's just so much I disagree with him about, and he's just ferociously more sure than right. I don't want to say anything bad about him, and I mean, mainly because he's a friend of Morgoth's, who I do like. But what would we talk about? part of the conversation thing is that not only do you have to like kind of go back and forth, but it has to be a pleasure. And I'm not sure where I would find pleasure in conversation with Keith Woods at this point. Okay, Jesse J. Semigog Happy Homelands now co-hosted by Styx. And it would get you out in front of more people. It would be great to see you there. Well, I love the idea. I had Styx as a guest one time. Have not interacted with him since. So if you guys know some way to get on there, let me know. King Samafish, Semigog, it's complicated as fuck. It's kind of similar to a nuke sub-captain. Had relationship issues. It matters. We need a high level as fuck relationship counselor or some shit for things. Mr. Salmonfish, if you don't mind, I'll call you King. King, I still don't know what the hell you're talking about, man. Okay, where are we now? Come in. Breaker. Where are we? Data is gay. Adherent of Lady Columbia says, Semigog, would globalism only work in an interplanetary colonization? I don't know, and I've got 4 minutes left, so I hate to do it to you twice, man, but I mean, that's the basic idea of that horrible movie Independence Day, where, you know, the Arabs and the Jews fly together to attack the space aliens because we're all been brought together by having a common enemy outside this world. Okay, Waldo Ludowski says, Stick Hexenhammer brought me here years ago. I did not know that. Wow, you must have been around for a while, man. Right on, thank you. All right, where are we now? Und wer are we now? Sorry, just trying to catch up here, people. Adam Lowe says, I wouldn't want to pleasure myself to Keith Woods either. Now, fuck you, that's not what I said. I deserve it, I get it, and I should have seen it coming, but where am I, man? Darkest Sky says Morgoth is a philosopher king. Yeah, Morgoth is a proper, as I put it in Twitter, he's a proper hedge scholar, which is not any insult. I think of myself as a hedge scholar. You know, outside the institutions, out there doing your own thing, but he's a proper scholar. Now, there are a number of places where, at least in important points of detail, I disagree with him, but it's impossible to dislike him. And when he laughs, he's actually enjoying himself. Plus, listening to him speak, I now know what English is supposed to sound like. I realize what it is. It's the Y's in those words. Like, they'll be like, Facebook. They put that little Y sound in there. And what it is the only people left in the fucking UK who still speak like proper Anglo-Saxons are in the north. And you could see it, like I was watching that horrible, I shouldn't even admit it, that horrible TV show, The Last Kingdom or whatever it is, that damn, I am Uhtred of Babenberg. Anyway, in it, it'll show like Winchester, and then it'll say Winterkester. And I realized that's it, Kester, Facebook. That Y that they'll put in those consonants. See, Morgoth and his crew, they actually speak like English men. I don't know what the rest of that shit is. It's Celts or Brythonic, or, you know, I listen to AA talk and he won't say other, he'll say ether. Like, I don't know how they speak, but I believe that everyone in the United Kingdom, all of them should speak the way Morgoth does. And that is my final word on the matter. Doomer Tears says, Semigog, what are your ethnicities? My mother's father was 100% Italian from Tuscany. My mother's mother was half German, probably from Alsace-Lorraine border area, and half Greek from the Gulf of Corinth, Kyoto. And my father's father was half German, Grosch, and half French. But I don't know exactly from where in France. I just know they were Catholic. and that they sailed from Le Havre. And then my father's mother was English for sure, and then the other half is somewhere in the British Isles, but I'm not sure where. So it's say one is English, the other's British. It's Osborne with no E at the end, Osborn, and I haven't been able to figure out what part of UK that would have been. So French, German, English, Italian, and Greek. Fiend J says, I'm almost to the end here. I'm going to have to look fast. Okay, good. That's the last question. This is the last one I'm taking, is this one from Fiend J. Have I seen the movie Metropolis from 1927? If yes, opinions. I've seen a few minutes of it. Can't offer you an opinion on it, though I did see that on Frody's Guide to Culture, which I recommend to everyone. He's got tons of people who came on and talked about all kinds of movies. A lot of those discussions are very interesting. He's got a discussion of Metropolis that's actually, I found it very interesting. So go check out Frody's Guide to Culture. That's spelled with a K, Kulchur. And and I'll try, Fiend J, I'll try to watch Metropolis so I can give you an opinion on it at some point. Okay. Darkest Sky says, you should do your family tree. I have. I've traced it way, way back in certain directions. My Timken family, I've traced back to the 16th century in northern Germany near the German Bight. I've traced some of my French ancestors who came over to what's now New Brunswick in the 1660s. They were the earliest ones in the New World. I've traced some of the English to coming to the U.S. in 1754. My Timken ancestors came from Germany and arrived in Louisiana in the 1830s. I've traced all of it. I just can't trace down the damn Osborns. So, yeah. All right. Here's a poem. Let me see one if I got one in the book. Where's a short one? And I will be out of here. I've read all these goddamn poems to you guys before. Here's a short one. Do I want to do one about Eastern Europe? No. Oh, I already did that one. This is going to be it, ladies and gentlemen. Prepare. I'm fitting to run. God, I got to change how this is laid out too. It's too close to the center of the page. Maybe Vice. Or the poem about women is too goddamn long. All right, that's going to be it. It's going to be Vice. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I will bid you adieu. So before I read this poem, after which I will just immediately scoot out. Thank you all very much for joining me and checking all of this out. I appreciate Fiend J doing the mod work. I appreciate all of you guys who have followed the channel for so very long, and I will try to do live streams more frequently in future. And perhaps I can even get rid of this damn white noise fan in the background. Anyway, thank you all very, very much. Okay, so before I disappear, here is the poem. Vice, with warlike aspect, marks the significant threshold. Innumerable feet wear away the stone, with a side-winding slither into a slippery curve. The road from ignorance to knowing better, where each milestone marks a fall. Prudentius warns, avarice nightwise enters the camp of the virtues disguised as thrift, who coughing dust resembles death gnawing a hardtack under a hot white light, while Blake sings, shame is pride's cloak. In a 15th century somewhere, vanity's silly bitches, promenading the season's teeter-tall shoes, tread the pebble of chance, fall and break their slender necks, beautiful for once, redeemed in purpling crimson illuminations. There is no shortcut. In time, the seasons will show you. Virtue, patient friend, The one is nothing but the seed of the other.